Good morning. It seems like the fall has arrived, and I was feeling rather melancholy both about the arrival of fall and about the subject of the lectures at the moment, that I was going to try and play you Adele, and to mark the fact that, you know, she's got a sore throat at the moment, but it didn't work. So that was Noel Coward's stately homes of old England. Couple of things before we get going. I want to breathe new life into the B-Space chat room, and so my suggestion is that I want you to post suggestions for categories of awards, okay, for an end of semester awards ceremony. I'm thinking, and she's not here so I can do this without embarrassing her, that for instance one category of award would be the best sneeze, that Charlotte would have won hands down. You could come up with any category: most boring lecture, you know, most fabulous outfit that someone's worn, whatever you want. Maybe votes on the worst music suggestion. In other words, I'm inviting you to be generally unkind. I don't mind if you're unkind about me, that's absolutely fine. Try not to be unkind about your peers. And also, I'm inviting nominations, given that the choice of the music requests have also shriveled up, that I'm suggesting, I want nominations, and I'm stealing this from a colleague, Yuri Slezkin, who told me about him doing it last night, the most cheesy music video or song that you can find on YouTube. Has to be British. Okay, I'm imagining that there's going to be a lot of new romantic stuff from the 1980s, but you can choose anything that you like, okay, and it's got to be truly gross and horrible, and we can have fun playing them over the next couple of weeks before we head into the final exam frenzy. Okay, so I think this lecture is going to be pretty self-explanatory, and so I'm going to move on now that you've got the headings to tell you what this is about. So let me begin by reminding you that on Tuesday I was talking to you about the creation of this new social democratic system that combined the Keynesian management of the economy through public and private ownership, and the central institutions of the welfare state. And I suggested to you that at the moment of its very foundation by the post-war Labour government, it was compromised. It was severely, or importantly, significantly compromised. And I suggest it was compromised in a variety of different ways. First of all, just as we saw that liberalism failed to live out its universal aspirations and ambitions, so I suggested that social democracy, intended to provide social security and opportunity for everybody, and yet remained structured by a real understanding of differences of gender and of class, particularly. And in part, I was suggesting that that was a legacy of that old liberal heritage that you saw in the Beveridge report and his description of the five great evils, and the attempt of the welfare state to enable individual responsibility while providing universal forms of welfare. How is it that you continue to make the individual take responsibility for their lives in this new system? Second way I suggested it was compromised was because I described it as a technocratic, not a democratic revolution. It was a system that was in many ways engineered by experts, by the social scientists, by the planners, by the engineers that we learned were emerging in the 1920s and 1930s. And finally, I suggested it was compromised by its failure to deliver the vision of the society and the infrastructure for that society that it had laid out. It failed to build as many schools and as hospitals and as houses, all that type of material infrastructure of the system. And I suggested that in part that was because it was working under the constraints of the financial constraints of the costs of the Second World War, which had of course followed those of the First World War and the financial collapse of the late 20s and early 1930s. Okay, so that's the beast that we're talking about. And we're going to be moving chronologically on today to see what happens to this system. And the most important thing I want to get across to you first is that just as I talked about liberalism as being the shared common sense of parties across the political spectrum, so with social democracy, there was a general consensus about that this was the way to manage the economy and society. The Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, and the Labour Party all were committed to the idea of the welfare state and to a mixed economy. Okay? Very important to emphasize that. The Conservative Party, which is akin to the Republican Party in the US, was committed to the mixed economy, committed to having certain sections of the economy under public ownership. In a way, it was this new consensus that was the most remarkable achievement of the post-war Labour government. That the fact that they had moved the entire ideological structure of politics to this position, where the other parties effectively agreed with its central planks. Social democracy had become, in the 1950s and the 1960s, the common sense of the age that all politicians adhered to. However, there were real difference of emphases within that shared common sense. There was a different emphasis, for instance, about the role of the state in people's lives and about the precise balance of public and private ownership of the means of production. But although there are those differences, both political parties, and I'm talking about the Conservative and the Labour Party because the Liberal Party by this point has become a not very significant party, both these political parties believe that the central task of government is to improve the standard of living of the population, to deliver prosperity and what was termed affluence for all. Okay? This is very, very important. The government of both political parties are committing to improving the standards of living of everybody. And it's no coincidence, and this is just as a side note, it's no coincidence that it's in the 1950s and the 1960s that historians become obsessed about the rise or fall of standards of living in the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so there's enormous. I grew up following these big debates between gigantic historians, and they were basically arguing about, did the Industrial Revolution improve the standards of living for people or decrease it? In other words, the academic Labour was, in a way, similarly obsessed around this question of affluence and the standard of living. So, what I'm suggesting then is that a lot of the ideological heat had been taken out of politics because everybody more or less shared the same principles. And I'm going to suggest to you today that politics became increasingly about managing the economy to deliver those improved standards of living and to take care of the population. And this is, I think, fantastically reflected in this Conservative election poster from 1964. And you'll see throughout this lecture there'll be a great deal of emphasis about which party is best going to deliver an improved standard of living. So if politics becomes about managing the economy, and it then new types of, it also takes new political forms. Okay, and really what I'm going to be talking to you today, in part, is about the emergence of the world of politics that we now inhabit. That is a politics that is conducted through advertising campaigns and primarily on TV. Okay, so think of this lecture as part of a continuing concern in this class with the transformation of how it is that people actually do politics, how it is that we actually practice politics. Think of those Hogarth prints of that old disruptive customary election culture. Think of that beginning of the mass party political system and the invention of the secret ballot. And now we're into a new phase which effectively transforms how we think and behave politically. Okay, so let's talk about the politics of affluence. First thing to say is that the Conservative Party is elected in 1951. So the Labour Party constructs this new system and is then soundly defeated. And the Conservative Party returns to power in 1951, and it remains in power for 13 years. Okay? It's in power until 1964. So if you like, the very high watermark of social democracy is achieved under conservative rule. And there's a great irony there, because the Conservative Party, as you know, was the party of old aristocratic privilege, and now it's presiding over this new social democratic system. And yet, it also provides a very different type of image of the Britain that it's governing. And just as the Labour Party had put on the brand new shiny world of the Festival of Britain in 1951 to project its image of the nation, arguably the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953 provided a type of counterpoint to the festival. Okay? Many people believed that here was a summoning up to the old version of an aristocratic and monarchical country. So even though I played you Noel Coward's Stately Homes of England, which is about the decline of the aristocracy that came out in 1938, the aristocracy actually remained pretty central stage in the late 1930s. Chamberlain's government had 10 peers of the realm in the cabinet, and there were 30 other members 30 other lords elected to the House of Commons in 1935. Okay. In the post-war period, what you have is not just the continuation of the aristocratic hold on politics. If you think of all the post-war Conservative prime ministers, Winston Churchill, Anthony Eden, Harold Macmillan, Hume, all of them are aristocrats. Every single one of them are aristocrats who live in big, stately homes. Okay? It's not until Edward Heath is elected as leader of the Conservative Party in the 1970s that you have the first Conservative leader who is not an aristocrat, and Margaret Thatcher was the second. Okay? So this remains very much an aristocratic party in some ways. 75% of Conservative MPs had been privately educated, and that compared to 20% of the Labour Party. And I should say, just so you get the full picture here, that this political establishment remains a resolutely masculine one. Okay? There were just 24 women MPs in 1945, and effectively that number remained static down until down to 19